So, with this lecture, we're kind of cleaning up what was left over from the last module, which this week you can continue to work on. Though please have your outlines ready by the end of the week. And I've got some emails from a couple of students who are saying, oh, no one's really posting in my group, etc., etc. And so as I did in the Zoom call, I'm going to once again remind you that you will be graded on your discussion in your group and on the main discussion board. Not for accuracy, but for participation, for enthusiastic participation, and also for your outlines, right? So, if I get an email saying, oh, this one person in our group just didn't participate in the email, etc., or didn't participate in the outline, etc., wasn't part of it, right? So this is the time to log on, and if you have not already, contribute. So finishing up last week, I'm going to talk about the Tolstoy excerpt, and then talk a little bit about the Vinitsky reading to start us on Module 2 this week. So this excerpt from Tolstoy, it's from War and Peace. Just to give some background, the novel is obviously huge, sort of like famously huge, right? The novel is famously huge. It involves many, many things. But this chapter stands alone pretty well. All you really need to know is that, and this is a real thing that happened, there's partly the novel deals with real history. Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. And his forces march towards Moscow, the capital. And it is decided as a military strategy decision to let them take it. And this actually proves to be a smart thing. The city itself is ransacked, burnt down, destroyed. People are, told to evacuate. They're letting the French have it. But thereafter, after a hard march across Russia from France, just going all the way across Europe, etc., fighting the Russians along the way, the French army gets to Moscow, and, just there's looting and burning, they ransack, they pillage. Basically, the French lose control of their army. And this gives the Russian army time to sort of regroup, bear down on them, and basically escort them out of the country. And that's the end of that. Of course, if you lived in Moscow at the time, it was incredibly stressful, right? Because you're told to evacuate. And what's happening here is that we see Rostopchin, who is theoretically the let us say the mayor of Moscow, the guy in charge, freaking out because he feels he's been betrayed by this military decision. Vereshchagin is the son of a local Moscow merchant. He is a student radical. He has done absolutely nothing to precipitate the invasion of Russia or the downfall of Moscow. He is, like I said, a student radical. He's gotten in charge for publishing some incendiary things. He is not a spy for the French. He is not working for the French. He's just some poor kid. And that's, sort of the background that's necessary for considering this. And other than that, it stands on its own. And I just wanted to point some things out, and we can talk a little bit about this in the Zoom call. One thing is to think about the ways in which Tolstoy uses madness. And we see it in a few places. Rostopchin himself, right? He is standing there, looking down at this crowd. This is what they've done with Russia. This is what they've done with me, thought Rostopchin, an irrepressible rage welling up in his soul against the someone to whom what was happening might be attributed. As often happens with hot-tempered men, his wrath had taken possession of him, even while he was seeking an object for it. There they are, the rabble, the dregs of the populace. The plebeians they have roused in their folly, they want a victim. And this thought occurred to him because he himself wanted a scapegoat, an object for his wrath. And Tolstoy's very clear, and this is Tolstoy's style in his writing. He writes in a style that is known as critical realism, that is, as a stylistic mode of writing, is completely realistic and completely omniscient, theoretically, right? So we look right into Rostopchin, and in the clearest possible way and with the utmost authority, the author, the authorial voice here, asserts what's going on with Rostopchin, right? Regardless of what Rostopchin knows about himself, has revealed to others around him in the plot, etc., right? And so that's part of Tolstoy's style, both in this book and elsewhere. This becomes significant later on. It's one of the reasons I mention it. So they drag poor Vereshchagin out, the young man, clanking his chains, moved with difficulty to the spot indicated, twice twisting his long neck this way and that, as with one finger he drew away the coat collar that was chafing his neck. Then he sighed, and with a gesture of resignation folded his delicate hands, which were unused to work, across his stomach. We are told of him, in this description, he had a thin neck, and the half of his head that had been shaved was covered with short hair. He wore a threadbare blue cloth coat lined with fox fur, which had once been stylish, and dirty hempen convict trousers thrust into thin, unpolished, down-at-heel boots. His uncertain gait was hampered with the heavy shackles on his weak, thin legs. Rostopchin, meanwhile, furiously strides out to the porch. So here is this picture of this young man who is, depicted as dirty and scrawny, and his head is shaved, and his clothing is, dilapidated, and just this truly scrawny, pathetic, abused, dirty figure. Right? The young man in the fur-lined coat stood in a submissive attitude, his hands folded over his stomach, stooping slightly, his young, emaciated face, disfigured by the half-shaven head, drooped with an expression of hopelessness. At the Count's first words, he slowly raised his head and looked up at him as though wishing to say something, or at least to meet his eye, but Rostopchin did not look at him. A blue vein behind the young man's ear distended and stood out like a cord on his long, thin neck, and suddenly his face flushed. And I think in this description, one person that Vereshchagin resembles is Christ, right? If you're at all familiar with the Passion of the Christ, with the portion of the Gospel that describes Jesus being condemned to death, tortured, and killed, I'm sure if nothing else you've seen a crucifix or some art that depicts this, right? And this, beat up, scrawny, scraggly, abused man, right? Hung up and dying on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Right? And so I think there's a deliberate parallel to this, right? Insofar as Vereshchagin is being made a scapegoat by Rostopchin, he is an innocent victim, and so he will suffer for others, right? Theoretically, for their, peace of mind. Certainly for Rostopchin's, or that's what Rostopchin hopes, right? He's betrayed his Tsar and his fatherland. He's gone over to Bonaparte. He alone, of all the Russians, has disgraced the name of Russia, and because of him, Moscow will perish, said Rostopchin in a shrill, even voice. But all at once, glancing down at Vereshchagin, who continued to stand in the same submissive attitude, as if driven to a frenzy by what he saw, he flung up his arms and all but yelled at the people, "Deal with him as you see fit. I hand him over to you." And so we see a kind of madness in Rostopchin. Someone whom, we would not as a character think of as being mad per se, right? Mentally ill in that sense. But it seems to be taken over by some kind of madness. He turns this young man over to the crowd, to be killed. And it's hard to make them do it, but they finally get pushed to it. Someone finally hits him. One of the soldiers, whose face suddenly distorted with fury. Right, there's something strange happening here, because why would... struck Vereshchagin on the head with the blunt edge of his saber. Ah! Vereshchagin uttered a brief cry of surprise, looking around him in alarm, as if not understanding why this was done to him. A similar moan of surprise and horror ran through the crowd. "Oh Lord!" someone exclaimed sorrowfully. But after the exclamation of surprise that had escaped from Vereshchagin, he uttered a piteous cry of pain, and that cry was his undoing. The barrier of human feeling, strained to the utmost but still holding the mob in check, gave way. Once begun, the consummation of the crime was inevitable. And the mob kills him. They tear at him and beat at him. A savage cry fell with him under the feet of the trampling, frenzied mob. Despite the feverish haste with which the mob tried to finish what it had begun, it was a long time before those who were hitting, throttling, and mangling Vereshchagin were able to kill him. "What about hitting him with an axe? Crush him, traitor! He sold Christ! Still alive! He's a tough one! Serves him right! Try a hatchet! Not dead yet!" Only when the victim ceased to struggle, and his cries changed to a measured, long-drawn death rattle, did the crowd around this prostrate, bleeding corpse begin hurriedly to shift places. Each one went up to it, looked at what had been done, and appalled, aghast, remorseful, pushed his way back again. "Oh Lord, these people are like wild beasts. How could he be alive? And such a young fellow, too. Must have been a merchant's son. What people? And they say he's not even the right one. What do you mean, not the right one? Oh Lord, and there's another one that has been beaten, too. They say he's about done for. Ugh, what people! They have no fear of sin." And so again, we see now we have a kind of mob madness, right? These people who had to be, intensely incited to violence, commit that violence, and then are immediately brought back to their senses and shocked and appalled at what they've done. So there is this mob madness, this madness of the crowd. Rostopchin. At the moment when Vereshchagin fell and the crowd closed in with a savage roar, Rostopchin suddenly turned pale, and instead of going to the back entrance where his carriage was waiting, strode rapidly along the corridor leading to the rooms on the ground floor, his head down, not knowing where he was going or why. The Count's face was white, and he could not control the feverish twitching of his jaw. "This way, Your Excellence. Where are you going? This way, please," said a trembling, frightened voice behind him. Count Rostopchin was incapable of making any reply. He, too, seems to have lapsed in this fugue, like he can't believe what he's done, or he's not processing what he's done in some way. He's kind of lost it out there on the balcony in inciting this violence, and then afterwards there's some aide trying to be like, sir, you have to, and he's not with it. This kind of temporary madness has been sent upon him as well. And so here are two examples of madness where Tolstoy is sort of talking about, both on an individual level and on a crowd level, this kind of it's something political, it's something social, it's something right, so it's temporary, but it's incredibly violent, right? And so to think about what he's representing there and what he's trying to say about humans, right? And then we also get to, alright, so Rostopchin gets in his carriage, drives away from Moscow, starts to feel better, starts to justify himself to himself. Lightly swaying on the resilient springs of his carriage and no longer hearing the horrifying sound of the mob, Rostopchin grew physically calm, and, as always happens, physical relief prompts the mind to devise grounds for mental tranquility. The thought that soothed Rostopchin was not a new one. Since the world began, men have killed one another. No one has ever committed such a crime without consoling himself with the same idea, and that idea is le bien public, the hypothetical welfare of other people. So, Vereshchagin was tried and condemned to death, Rostopchin reflected, though in fact he had not been. He was a spy and a traitor. I could not let him go unpunished. I have killed 2 birds with 1 stone. I appeased the mob by giving them a victim and punished a malefactor. The mob didn't need appeased. He drove them to it, right? But he's setting himself to rights. He's got himself justified to himself. The Count completely regained his composure. And then we have this encounter. The Sokolniki plain was deserted. Only at one end, in front of the almshouse and the insane asylum, were seen little clusters of people in white clothing, and others like them wandering singly over the field, shouting and gesticulating. One of them was running straight toward the Count, along which One of them was running straight toward the road, along which Count Rostopchin was driving, and the Count, his coachman, and his escort of dragoons all looked with a vague mixture of consternation and curiosity at these lunatics turned loose, and especially at the one who was running towards him. So driving past an asylum, one of the madmen are allowed out into the yard, and one of them starts running towards him, reeling along as fast as his long, thin legs would carry him. With his dressing gown flapping and his voice fixed on Rostopchin, he was shouting in a hoarse voice and making signs to him to stop. The madman's solemn, impassioned face, with its uneven tufts of beard, was gaunt and yellow. His eyes, with their black agate pupils and saffron-yellow whites, rolled excitedly. "Wait, stop, I tell you!" he cried in a piercing voice, and once more fell to shouting breathlessly with emphatic intonations and gestures. He reached the Kalash and ran beside it. "Thrice have they slain me, and thrice have I risen from the dead. They stoned me, crucified me. I shall rise, shall rise, shall rise. They have lacerated my body. The kingdom of God will be overthrown. Thrice will I overthrow it, and thrice erect it again," he cried, his voice growing shriller and shriller. Count Rostopchin suddenly turned pale, as he had done when the mob fell on Vereshchagin. He turned away. Go faster," he ordered the coachman in an unsteady voice. So here we have an encounter with a madman, and I would say that this madman resembles a few things. One, I would say he resembles a holy fool, right? In the descriptions of them physically that we read, if we think back to Ivanov and Thompson, who of course agree about the sort of general appearance and behavior of holy fools, if we think about this scrawny, dirty, yelling man, he's yelling about sin, but it's incomprehensible. Right, here's a holy fool. I would say here also is somebody who resembles Christ. He is comparing himself to Christ, for the same reasons that Vereshchagin did, and therefore he also resembles Vereshchagin. So we have this, in terms of characterizing physically these characters, in terms of their description, right, there is a congruence here. And obviously something reminds Rostopchin. Rostopchin freaks out again, right? This madman, who is theoretically this is just gibberish. It affects Rostopchin. The Kalash flew over the ground at full speed, but for a long time Count Rostopchin continued to hear the insane, frantic shrieks echoing in the distance, while seeing before him nothing but the terrified, wondering, blood-stained face of the traitor in the fur-lined coat. He has seen Vereshchagin in the madman. Recent as that mental picture was, Rostopchin now felt that it was deeply incised on his heart. He clearly realized that time would never dim the bloody imprint of that recollection, but that, on the contrary, the longer he lived, the more cruelly and corrosively would that memory eat into his heart. He still seemed to hear the sound of his own words, "Cut him down, I command it." Why did I utter those words? Something mysterious happens here. And this is sort of why, too, I brought up Tolstoy style. Remember earlier, and throughout this book, the authorial voice, the authorial knowledge is omniscient, right? We reach right into Rostopchin's head, and we know exactly what he is doing and why he is doing it. That is available to Tolstoy as an author in the style he has chosen. And yet this is much less clear. He had justified himself to himself. He had done a terrible thing with what he had done to Vereshchagin, But, you know, he's riding out of town feeling good about himself. And we get the impression that he may have continued to, you know, feel fine about himself for the rest of his life. But he meets this madman who, again, if we revisit the literal text of the madman's behavior and words, they don't have anything to do with Rostopchín. They're fundamentally incomprehensible, right? It's just Christian-themed gibberish. And yet, this brings about a reckoning in Rostopchín. Not just that he realizes he will be haunted by this his entire life. It seems to insist that he will be haunted at all, right? He had this squared away, and then all of a sudden he didn't. This encounter with this holy fool who resembles Vereshchagin, who resembles Christ, is this confrontation of Rostopchín with his own sin, which he will now suffer from, and forever, apparently. There is no, like, possibility of redemption here, which is interesting, I think. And the style does not describe how this works. I said, you know, this entire book is written in this style where theoretically Tolstoy could have explained all of this flat out. And then the holy fool approached Rostopchín, and through the grace of God, blah, blah, blah. But he doesn't. Something mysterious happens in this encounter. And that's it. And I think that goes along well with Ivanov's description and the Russian understanding generally of their own tradition of holy foolery, of Yuratstvo. That this is a mystery, but it is one filled with truth, right? Because Rostopchín must confront the truth of what he has done. But it's not something that can be described. We can't put it into words. We can't explain it. All these other things in this book that we can explain, but we can't explain this. It just is. And the style, you know, clamp. It's noticeable. I said, especially if you read the entire book, or a lot of Tolstoy's work in general. It's noticeable. The style just... Everything else we can explain this, but it happens. So, I think those are some important things to consider about madness in this piece. And I think we can return to this too. One of the things we're talking about in the second module is this idea of 19th century madness, which of course Tolstoy actually falls into, right? And the transition from one way of thinking about madness in Russian culture to another, although obviously the original way of thinking about it, holy foolery, etc., does not go away. It's now another dvoiveria, right? It's another thing that coincides with its opposite somehow. And so with that, I'm going to set this aside. As I said, we can talk about it in the call if you want. You can discuss it on the discussion boards in the meantime. I just want to turn to the Vinitsky article. I think the Vinitsky article itself is pretty clear in what it's talking about. And I've assigned sort of parsing it specifically to one of the group discussions for Module 2, so I don't want to belabor it, but I do want to give a little context to it. I mean, one thing we have seen is that Russia is set behind Europe by historical events, right? In terms of all kinds of cultural and scientific understandings. And so most recently, in terms of material history of Russia, we had been discussing the reign of Ivan IV, right? The sort of 1600s England, you know, there's a time of troubles into the 1600s with Russia. England kind of rediscovers the Western Europe kind of rediscovers Russia in the 1500s. There's this, you know, and they're seen as backwards by the Western, even though they had been keeping, you know, Russia had been keeping pace with Europe until the Mongol invasion in the 1200s, right? So we see this kind of, we're being held back, and of course this has to do with the understanding of madness. There's just no sense of mental illness, of a disease etiology for madness. It just doesn't exist in Russian culture. Until, in the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s, Peter the Great is a westernizer. He is going to bring Russia up to speed. He's going to rebuild Russia. He constructs the city of St. Petersburg on one of the few sea routes available to Russians for Western Europe, up by Finland. Builds this entire new city in this classical Western architectural style, imports particularly a lot of Germans to do this kind of craftsman work, so there's this cultural influx into the country. Kills about 100,000 serfs on this project because he's building this thing in a freezing marsh, etc. He's concerned more with bureaucracy than ideas. Fast forward into the middle of the 1700s. Catherine the Great is a German princess. She comes to Russia. She becomes the empress by marriage. Her husband is a dreadful Tsar, whom she hates, and she calls crazy. And he is killed. Her involvement in this is lost to time. But then as Vinitsky goes on to describe, she, as a young empress who is not technically Russian, although she has learned the language and converted to Orthodoxy, even though she was never religious, she's still not religious, and she hates the church and she hates religion. And she acts on that for the rest of her life. She has to justify herself as the new empress. And she begins to do this, and I said Vinitsky will describe this, by saying that her husband was crazy, but luckily she is a beacon of light. And all of this, the kind of context that I want to get into, that I want to give you, has to do with Enlightenment values, because then this is what she does. Pen pal to Voltaire, she brings the Enlightenment to Russia, at least to the upper classes, the intellectuals of Russia. Starting in the 15 and 1600s, coming to full flower in the 1700s, in Western Europe, there is a movement, let us call it a cultural zeitgeist, that affects religion and culture, government, philosophy, which is important at the time, right? I mean, like philosophers, art and literature, this idea of the Enlightenment. And the underlying idea of the Enlightenment grows in a lot of ways out of economic changes that are occurring in Europe, out of religious changes, changes in the church, out of technological and scientific developments. A lot of the beginnings of what comes to be Enlightenment thought comes begins clear back in the Renaissance, when we have the Middle Ages giving way to sort of new discoveries, the rediscovery of classical learning in Europe after the Dark Ages, right? So you have the fall of Rome, you have the Dark Ages, throughout medieval times in Western Europe. There's a kind of slow rediscovery of classic scientific and philosophical concepts. The Moors in Spain, their occupation of Spain brings back mathematics into Europe. The rediscovery in what is now Italy and Greece, sort of reignite recourse to classic texts. There are, as I said, technological and economic changes that sort of open up the country and open up thinking in these ways. And basically, by the 1700s, you are left with this polyvalent cultural philosophy about truth. And fundamentally, this idea that there is a capital T truth of the world. And if we just reason hard enough, if we just science hard enough, we can know this truth. And this truth encompasses, the earth itself, plants, animals, humans, both in body and mind, government, economy, any kind of, system or structure like that, the legal system, the, educational systems, religious systems, we've been through the Protestant Reformation, right? We have now this just, splintering religious world, moving, many of the Enlightenment thinkers moving to deism or outright atheism. We can know the truth of the world. It's one thing and it's knowable. And once we know it, we can use it to control for our own benefit. And this is utopian thinking. And it leads to certain systems, ways to approach things, that we will go and we will find and we will see and we will take and we will dissect and we will examine and we will name and we will classify and we will categorize and we will systematize and we will use. This whole system of knowledge creation. Like, how do we get knowledge? To try and pick a somewhat benign example, our technology allows us to go to some new corner of the world and we find a plant there and we study it in its environment and then we pluck it up and we dissect it and we subject it to experiments and we bring it home with us and we draw it and we name it. Never mind that I'm sure it had a name amongst the people that were, already familiar with it, wherever that was. And we put it, Linnaeus, right? We put it in relation to other things. We categorize it. We fit it into our system of knowledge. We declare that we know it, and now it's ours to use, however we decide to do so. Sometimes this is bad. Fundamentally, this is still how the West handles the creation of knowledge, and the things that I just described, in a way, it's not necessarily bad. It gives us cancer drugs. But there's also something, there's something inaccurate about it. There is no one single capital T truth to the world, and it is not wholly discoverable and manipulable by us, at least according to any evidence that we've ever had, right? Two, there is something obviously atomizing and pillaging and depressing a little bit about this. And the reaction to this gives us the Romantics, and we're going to talk about them next week when we talk about Pushkin. But this Enlightenment worldview, that we will know the truth of the world so that we can control the world, and we will get at this truth through a system of, taking and dissecting and claiming and naming and categorizing and systematizing and putting to use. This is a whole philosophy of existence, right? This is like an ontological as well as an epistemological zeitgeist that takes over everything in Europe, by and large. And then I said there's reactions against it, and we'll talk about that later. But this is fundamentally what Catherine is importing to Russia. And as we know, this is foreign to Russia. It's foreign to the pre-Christian traditions of Russia. It's foreign to the Eastern Orthodox mystical Christianity concepts in Russia. It's foreign to the Dvoiveria that develops between these two things. It's foreign. But come the 1700s, the educated aristocratic elite of the country is sort of mandated to learn these things and to subscribe to them, and et cetera, and it trickles down to this alienated class of intellectuals who, for various political reasons at this time, her reign is like 50 years long. She rules the country forever. 60 years, I think. And one of the things that happens over this long reign is that she actually becomes more of an autocrat herself. She takes more and more power from the autocracy. She makes things worse for the serfs while claiming to be enlightened, right? And like talking about like the spirit of the laws and Montesquieu and so forth, right? French Revolution stuff. She makes things worse for the serfs. She takes more governmental power. And so now you have all of these people, these petty aristocrats, who have no role in government at all. They have no actual power in their society whatsoever other than economic power over serfs. They have been educated in this Enlightenment Western European tradition that I said is all, the same philosophers that America's founding fathers are drawing on when they're rebelling, right? We've got Voltaire, and we have Rousseau, and we have Montesquieu, all these ideas about freedom of the governed and freedom of the individuals and Locke and all that, right? I mean, all this stuff. She's educated all these people, and they have nowhere to go with any of this. And they kind of turn against her. And we'll see that in the Vinitsky reading too, that she has this political opposition of dissatisfied intellectuals sort of nipping at her heels. And she calls them crazy. This is one of the uses, and I said this is a group assignment, how to think about how Catherine uses madness as a political tool. She does it in different ways at different times in her reign, and this is one of them too. And I mean, remember when we talk about now we use melancholy as this little descriptor, but as Vinitsky makes clear, at the time, melancholy was seen as a dangerous disease. I mean, like a terrible, terrible depression, something that was deeply stigmatized because it was deeply understood to be dangerous to the person. It would lead to outright, just total insanity, psychopathy. That was the understanding of melancholy at the time, and she accuses her critics of being melancholics. Well, she, of course, is the Enlightenment Empress. She is reason and joviality itself. Enlightenment, it's right there in the name. And they're like, yep, we're melancholics. The way these things go. I will leave that to Vinitsky. I think he's pretty clear in his arguments, but I wanted to kind of give the background that this, because we're going to come up against this again, this Enlightenment ideology that takes over Western culture and eventually takes over Russian aristocratic and intellectual culture, except insofar as there's a backlash to it, right? The certain set of assumptions about the world and truth and knowledge, right? That is much larger than any one, literary movement or understanding of madness or anything like that, or governmental system or something. It's this huge idea. It's something we're still reckoning with in our own society today. And then, as I said, there's a backlash to this, to people who are like, God, even if I could bring all of nature to heal, I wouldn't want to. What kind of world do you want to live in? And those are the romantics, and we'll talk about those when we get to Pushkin. So, anyway, that is my discussion of Tolstoy and my introduction to Vinitsky, and we will talk about all of this more on Thursday.